If you don't intimidate the local population, they will throw you out.
So you can say that this kind of soft occupation is working by intimidating even the children.
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as soft. It's very targeted. So what the strategy of intimidation is, it doesn't apply to all 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. You won't see that kind of intimidation generally in Ramallah or places like that. But it's very targeted at any location, basically, where a Palestinian is going to come in close proximity with a settler. That Palestinian has to be taught to appreciate that you cannot in any way, shape or form, whether it's violent or peaceful, resist that settler. And if you do, you will find yourself in a military court.
We are not so many here, so if you have any questions, you are free to ask, please. There is a mic and a mic runner. If you want, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Hello, my name is Sarah, and I also work with Save the Children, and I've also previously been based in Jerusalem. I wanted to say, because the military, as an occupying force, they also have a duty to protect the civilian population among the locals. So how do you, because there we see, both, not just in terms of arrests, but aiming and maiming, and the number of civilians being killed, crossfire or targeted in many ways. How is that being discussed, or is it, within that system?
It certainly
military.
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, a lot of UN agencies and civil society focus on that issue. The problem here, though, is although we all analyze the situation in the West Bank, in Israel and Palestine, as a temporary military occupation, that's the language of the law, you don't have to be on the ground for very long, I'm sure you appreciate this, to appreciate that it's not a temporary military occupation. What is in fact going on in the West Bank and Jerusalem is a de facto annexation. And the problem is and basically what that means is it's taking the land without responsibility for the people. And that's essentially what's happening. And the problem with that is then it's completely inconsistent with many of those international legal principles, such as protecting the local population. Now, you can, if it's a temporary military occupation, you can protect the local population. The real dilemma here is once you start inserting settlers into occupied territory, your primary focus and your primary attention, forget about the law, in practical terms, is going to be how do you protect those settlers from Palestinians? Obviously that has nothing to do with the rule of law, but that is the practical dynamic on the ground. And that's the danger, that as I mentioned before, if you agree with that analysis, that it is a de facto annexation, and I think the evidence to support that is you have 600,000 Israeli civilians living in occupied territory. They've been there for 51 years, and the resources are also being taken. Those factors are consistent with an exercise of sovereignty, not a temporary military occupation. And the problem, if that is allowed to continue and succeed, then like I said before, what are we supposed to say to Putin when he annexes the rest of Ukraine? Like if I was Putin, as I said, I would say, tell it to the Israelis. And that is the danger, that we undermine this entire legal framework that really we put together at enormous cost in 1945.
Any other questions? Yes, please. There will come a mic.
My name is Jenna, and I'm not here with any organization. I'm just by myself. My question is regarding whether the children always are taking an active part in hostilities, and also to what extent the Geneva Conventions do provide protection where the CRC fails to do so, and also in regards to international customary law. So to what extent can we see that Israel is actually adhering to international customary law? Thank you.
So what we find with children is, again, I think to understand how and why they get arrested in general terms. Again, I think it's useful to walk in the shoes of a military commander. So imagine you're an Israeli commander responsible for the security of a settlement, and there may be, say, 600 settlers living in that settlement. And it's surrounded by 4 or 5 Palestinian villages. And you get a report one day that from a settler that they've seen a group of Palestinians on the side of the road throwing stones at settler vehicles. So you have an act of resistance within your jurisdiction. And the question for that military commander is, and it could be dangerous, if you're throwing rocks at a vehicle traveling at high speed, obviously you can do damage. And the dilemma for that commander is, how do you respond to that act of resistance? You know from experience, if you send a couple of jeeps to the location in the road where the report came from, in all probability the stone throwers will have run away. No one is silly enough in the West Bank to chuck rocks at settlers and hang around for the IDF to show up. So you're probably not going to catch anyone. So you have a real problem then. You have an act of resistance. You know it's Palestinians, but who are you going to prosecute and punish in the military courts? Essentially what that commander does is he makes 2 assumptions. And although I'm a lawyer, forget about the law. This has got nothing to do with the law. But from a military perspective, I think the assumptions are reasonable. Assumption 1 is the stone throwers were Palestinian males aged between about 10 and 30. Assumption 2 is they came from the nearest Palestinian village. And then what you do is you take those assumptions, you hand them over to the local Israeli intelligence officer. Every village in the West Bank has a designated Israeli intelligence officer. And he will see, the intelligence officer will look to see who have we arrested before for stone throwing, and more importantly will make contact with any collaborators or informants in the village to get information. That information then goes back to the commander and he makes arrests. Now, what this system is very good at is casting a very wide net. So when they make these arrests, without doubt, they probably will arrest some people who have been throwing stones, but they also scoop up a lot of people who haven't. And the effectiveness of this system is whether you prosecute the actual stone throwers or just someone in the village, you're sending a very strong message to everyone in that village. You resist us, someone will pay a price for it. And that's essentially the way it works. And it is, like I said, it's very, very effective. The Fourth Geneva Convention does provide some specific safeguards for children, but certainly the Convention on the Rights of the Child is much, much more detailed. Like, I think the Fourth Geneva Convention is limited to generally saying you must give special consideration to children, and that's about it. Customary international law, a lot of that has been codified in the Fourth Geneva Convention, the relevant principles. But whether you're talking about treaty law or customary law, you do pretty much find wholesale violations across the spectrum.
If I should be the soccer referee now, I should say that we have 3 extra minutes here. So because the time is running. So to wrap this up, I would like to ask you, Lena, we haven't talked so much about Save the Children related to this conflict, but if you could say something about what the Convention on the Right of the Child, what do you think the role could be in this kind of conflict that we have heard about from Gerard? And Gerard, is the convention, is it of any use for you, or is it just a nice piece of paper when you are working on the ground? That's the 2 last questions to you.
Okay, well, I think I could just reinforce a little bit what I just said, that I think we as an international movement, being Save the Children, we have to be strong and stand up for Convention of the Rights of the Child being applicable in all settings, as I said, and it's especially now when we hear this about what's happening in Palestine and on the West Bank, and how children are actually, their rights are not respected. I think we as a civil society organization should really step up to reinforce that message, and actually to work concretely, as we do, on the ground with our partners to actually support the population, and also to continue with our advocacy work on the international level Sweden has been, being a member of the UN Security Council, have been very strong in working on protecting children in armed conflict, and I think that is something that that now, if we speak about what will happen by the end of this year, Sweden will actually leave, and but we want children to. We want Sweden to put children's rights as a priority for the foreign policy, so that we can have strong messaging also from governments, and that also someone will take over the baton in the Security Council when Sweden is leaving this working group on protecting children in conflict. So I think that there has to be, things done on different levels. So we continue to working with our partners on the ground, but the international community really needs to step up to bring this recommitment back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and working with all available means to make this happen.
Thank you.
So, like we said before, I think the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a very useful benchmark. The problem, I think, in Israel-Palestine is not a shortage of law. There's more than enough law to sort out the situation. It's the accountability. And that's one thing. I've been working there for 10 years. And that's one thing that you always consider, is why does this legal framework not work very effectively? And ultimately, it does come down to interests. I'm not so familiar with the Swedish situation, but I'm more familiar with Britain. And so, for example, as I mentioned, this issue is very prominent in Britain. It's been raised a lot in the UK Parliament, and the British government takes it seriously in the sense that they raise it constantly with their Israeli counterparts in dialogue. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, when it comes to accountability, the British government takes active steps to ensure there is no accountability. Now, why is that? So they're happy to talk about it and to raise this at meetings, but they will take active steps to prevent accountability. And it comes down to interests. And so what are Britain's interests? Well, most of the UK's Middle East intelligence comes through Israel. That's highly valuable. Last year we had a record arms sales to Israel. And this year we have a record level of trade with Israel. Now, in the era of Brexit, we will take whatever trade we can get. And that's the problem, and you see this across the spectrum, where you have human rights on the one hand, and you have important financial security interests on the other. My experience is generally the only way you will succeed with the human rights is if you can align it with the interests. And if the interests and the human rights issues are aligned, you will get a result. If they diverge, then preeminence will be given to those other interests. So I think that the challenge for all of us who work on these issues is how do we try and make the case that human rights are an important interest, and try and close that gap between human rights interests and security, trade interests. Because until we close that gap, those other interests will generally prevail.
Thank you very much for this advice to all of us, and thank you for coming. We wish you good luck in your work. It's very important what you are doing, so we give them a hand.